Hey everyone, how's it going? Forrest here, again with another installment of my complete analysis of all of J.S. Bach's chorale harmonizations. I have a really sore throat after yesterday's video, and I am very thankful that we have a shorter chorale today. However, I'm going to be speaking a little bit more quietly today just because I want to preserve what little bit of my voice I have left. Today we are looking at Christ lag in Todesbanden, which translates to Christ lay in death's bonds. We've definitely looked at this text before, but it's been a while since we've looked at a harmonization of this melody, so we're going to just hop right into the analysis. We're going to see something that we encountered yesterday. No key signature, but we start on D minor and we end on D major. So although I believe the overall tonality of this chorale is D minor, we are going to be starting in the key of A minor because our first phrase ends in a perfect authentic cadence in the key of A minor. But if you're looking ahead, you'll see that this C sharp might be foreshadowing what's going to happen in the next phrase. So we start off with D minor. That is our 4 chord in the key of A minor. We also have a passing 7th in the tenor before we get D, B, F, and G sharp. Now this F looks quite a bit like a suspension based on the way that it is, the way that it looks on the page, its profile. But I think what's actually happening here is that this F, it is a suspension, but it's resolving to a dissonance, which is very interesting in terms of, how suspensions are traditionally taught in Western music theory. So I think even though you could analyze this as G sharp diminished over D, which would be a 7-4-3 chord, or G sharp minor 7 flat 5 over D, I think this is an E7 chord over D. And the reason why I say that is because of the next chord, which is A minor in first inversion, C, C, E, and A. Sorry, I got my clefs confused there, which is A minor in first inversion. And typically speaking, a 4-2 chord wants to resolve to a first inversion triad that is a fifth below the root of the previous chord. So 5 would want to go to 1, 6 would want to go to 2, following the cycle of falling fifths. Afterwards, we have 4 voices moving off of the harmonic rhythm. We have B, D, G sharp, and B, which is G sharp diminished over B. That's a 7-6 chord. And if you've seen any of my previous videos, you know what's coming next. It's an A minor triad in root position, A, E, A, and C. It's almost like this is the most consistent progression in all of Bach. Granted, we have seen a couple of variations here and there, but you can more or less expect this progression to function this way when it does occur in the chorales, and it does occur often. Next beat, this A sort of turns into a bit of a suspension of sorts. What I think actually is happening here is, even though we could analyze this chord as A, F, B, and D, which would be 7-4-2, or G sharp, or sorry, no, it wouldn't be 7-4-2, apologies. It would be 2-4-2, because we're not in the key of C major, we're in the key of A minor. I think it's more likely that this G sharp and this E is kind of an accessory to this G sharp, because the A is what's being suspended and the tenor changes. So actually, now that I say that, it makes sense that this is a 2-4-2 chord. And why do I say that? Because for the exact same reason that I believe this is a 5-4-2 chord, it resolving to 1-6. If this were a 2-4-2 chord, most likely what's happening here is that it is resolving to a 5-6 chord, or even more specifically a 5-6-5 chord, right? We have A, F, B, and D, which is B minor 7 flat 5 over A, and resolving down a fifth would be to E, and this is an E7 chord in first inversion, so the resolution happens the same way, or using the same logic that I use to figure out what chords are going on in the first measure. And of course afterwards we would expect the tonic triad, which we sort of get. We have A, E, B, and C, so the tonic triad's definitely being implied here, and I think that would be an accurate analysis. But I think all in all what we end up having here, because by the time the suspension gets resolved, Bach changes the bass and echoes the bass in the tenor, I think we have a deceptive progression where we get F major, F, F, A, and C instead of A minor, making this E an accented non-chord tone as well, sort of an accessory to this B. We're seeing this as a theme throughout the chorale so far, and we've barely just started. So after our 6 chord, you can expect that this is a turnaround of sorts because Bach is just going to use 6 most likely to go back to the tonic through a 2, which would subsequently go to a 5, and we would expect 5 to resolve to 1, and that's exactly what happens here. So we don't need to mark this A as well because it is a chord tone in F. We have D, F, A, and B. That's B minor 7 flat 5 over D, which is a 2-6-5 chord. This E is a non-chord tone, this E and this D are both non-chord tones, this G sharp is a non-chord tone, but if we take a look at all of the notes that are happening here on the offbeat, it spells E major, which is a 5 chord, fulfilling exactly what you would expect a 6 to go to in a nearby proximity cadential situation. And then we cadence not on A minor, but A major. I was talking about that C sharp a few minutes ago, A, C sharp, E, and A. That is still our tonic triad. This isn't a half cadence in D minor. This is an authentic cadence, but we're using the Picardy third, or Bach is using the Picardy third, and this is just going to be recontextualized as the dominant in the key of D minor, which is our macro tonic, our tonic of the entire chorale. So we don't modulate exactly to the key of D minor. It's not this A major chord that's going to be taking us there. It is the next A major chord. He introduces the idea on the cadence and then inverts it before we go to the key of D minor. We have C sharp, A, E, and A, which is another tonic triad still in first inversion, but in the key of D minor it is 5-6. I'm usually of the thought process that the modulation occurs as late as possible in these contexts because of the fact that we really have no reason to believe that we've modulated until the series of the same chord ends, right? Like if we saw 3 A major chords in succession here, A, what would make you feel like the first A was where we modulated rather than the third A, which is closer to the point in the chorale that we would modulate. In this case, we have 2 A majors. The second A major is closer to D minor. It makes me feel like that is the gateway to D minor, despite the chords being the same. That's my logic. So in this case, we have D, A, E, and F. We see this 9/8 suspension in the alto with D minor chords all the time in Bach. Saw it a ton yesterday. It's interesting. I think it might just be a sound that he favored, but we know that our tonic is being implied here. And by the time we get the resolution, the bass leaps up a third or skips up a third, depending on how you look at it. If you classify leaps and skips differently, I don't really think it matters too much. What does matter is that this is sort of a first inversion configuration of D minor, so I will mark that as something that's happening off of the harmonic rhythm. And then we are looking for the next chord, E, B flat, C sharp, and G, which is C sharp fully diminished over E. That is 7-6-5, and you would be expecting 1-6 going to 7-6-5 to take us to D minor, and he alludes to this, right? Because we get 2 passing Ds here, one in the alto and one in the bass, but he doesn't fulfill the chord progression. In fact, what he does instead, and I'm going to go ahead and erase the 7-6-5, not because it's wrong, but rather because I need more space. There we go, that should be better. Here on the offbeat, we have D, B flat, D, and G, which is like a passing 4-6-4 chord, or just a 4 chord if you feel like no, it would be a 4-6-4 chord because the bass is moving. Sometimes when the bass isn't moving, the inversion might not be as relevant, but I tend to always take the inversion into account. But the reason why I think this 4-6-4 chord is pertinent has to do with the chords that are happening on the harmonic rhythm, right? We go from 7-6-5 to C sharp, A, E, and A, which is A major over C sharp. That's a 5-6 chord, another dominant functioning chord. And as I've talked about in the past, 2 dominant functioning chords, one after the other, really isn't a progression. For starters, chords that are a third apart share more tones in common than they don't, so really you're not transitioning as much as say, between two chords that have less tones in common than they do, or they have less tones in less tones in common than they do, like two chords that are adjacent to one another. If you went from 4 to 5, like what's going on here, you have two entirely different chords. They have no tones in common. And that's sort of what the D does. It breaks up the tones that they have in common, right? Look, we have E in the bass here, and that turns into C sharp through this passing tone. We have C sharp here in the alto, and it moves to E through this passing tone, using D as kind of like a fulcrum that resets the tones that would otherwise be static if you were moving from 7 to 5, or vice versa, because those are the tones that the two chords have in common. So I think that's pretty neat that Bach is conscientious of this. It's pretty clear that he's conscientious of this, because this is something that we see with some frequency in the chorales. It's not something that we always see. You know, sometimes we do just see a plain old 5 chord going to a 7 chord, or actually it's usually 7 going to 5. 5 tends to have more of a impactful dominant function because of the cycle of falling fifths and the leading tone. But in this case, when we see 7 going to 5, it's just interesting that we have a chord that's used to break up the progression between the two of them. And something that I just realized is that there does not need to be parentheses around this 7-6-5 chord, because it is happening on the harmonic rhythm, and parentheses are used to distinguish what's happening off of the harmonic rhythm, or on the eighth notes that aren't numbered beats. But after our 5 chord, this A is a chord tone. We don't need to mark it. We then get D, A, E, and G. A bit of a kind of a double suspension here, where Bach has another 9/8 suspension here, where the E is being held over in the alto. But as an accessory to that, this G is also an accented non-chord tone. Really beautiful gesture here, but we know that our tonic is being implied, D, A, D, and F. Then we have A, C sharp, and E. That's our 5 chord, A major, A, F, D, and D. This F is a non-chord tone, and both of these Ds are non-chord tone. It's like a 1-6-4 chord here, D minor over A. And then we have A, G, D, and E. This D gets turned into a 4-3 suspension over the bass. And by the time we get the resolution, this G becomes no longer, I guess it is kind of a chord tone, but it's not part of the final contextualization of the chord. So I'm just going to mark it as 5, but I suppose you could mark it as 5-7 before our perfect authentic cadence, where we cadence on D minor, D, F, A, and D, which is of course our tonic triad. And we could put a little bracket here, even though the 1-6-4 chord is being more referenced than getting its own harmonic rhythm accent here. If the chord were to have occurred on beat 1, it would be a little bit more normal. Here we have 5-1-6-4, 5-1. That's pretty interesting. There's a lot of material jam-packed into this measure. Okay, looking ahead to the next section, we have an imperfect authentic cadence in the key of F major, and I think we spend the majority of the phrase in D minor, and we don't really modulate until here. That's just the way that I hear it. Bach, for the most part, is avoiding C's. We do see C here and C here, but they're all seen in descending contexts, which is typically the way that we'll see C naturals in A minor, in D minor. But yeah, we're just going to continue to analyze in the key of D minor here until we get to a point that feels a little bit more natural to analyze a modulation. So we start off with D minor, D, F, A, and D. No need to reanalyze. Passing tones in the tenor and the melody before we get D, A, D, and F. Another D minor chord, no need to reanalyze. And a delayed passing seventh here in the bass before we get B flat, G, D, and G, which is G minor in first inversion. That's a 4-6 chord. And we have some passing tones going on in the lower 3 voices. We have A, C, and G. A bit of like a passing A minor 7 chord here, which is kind of interesting, but I don't really think too much is being contributed to the chord progression of it all here because the chord is incomplete, so it feels more coincidental than anything else. But maybe Bach is alluding to something here. You could analyze something there if you were being particularly granular. And then afterwards we get G, B flat, and D, which is G minor in root position, so we'll just change the figured bass to reflect that. And after some passing tones in the upper voices, C and E, we have D, A, D, and F, which is D minor in root position, which is our tonic. And I think this is where we modulate to the key of F major. D minor is now our 6. This C is a passing tone, this F is a chord tone, this A is a chord tone as well, but when we add this C to the mix, it is kind of like getting a tonic triad in second inversion, 1-6-4, and it's happening as the bass is passing, so that's a good sign because that's a normative way to incorporate second inversion triads and functional harmonic music in Western European art music. This is just one of the configurations. We'll see a second inversion triad included into the texture. We then have B flat, F, D, and G. That's G minor 7 over B flat, which is 2-6-5. And in a very similar fashion to our first cadence, we get a subdivided 2-5-1 here, C, E, C, and G, which is our 5 chord. Then we cadence on F major, F, F, C, and A, tonic triad. It's interesting that F major has been an imperfect authentic cadence across both yesterday's chorale and today's chorale as well. You see the majority of the cadences in F major in yesterday's chorale as imperfect authentic cadences, as opposed to our D minor cadences, which are perfect authentic, which is kind of interesting. I don't know if I'm reading too much into it, but I feel like that's kind of an interesting coincidence. But looking ahead, we have maybe the most interesting phrase in the chorale, tied for the penultimate, or tied with the penultimate phrase in terms of interest, or like kind of the maker's marks of this particular chorale. We end in a perfect authentic cadence in the key of A minor, and we get this really slick movement from F to what I considered entirely A minor. The beginning of the phrase will lead you to believe that we're in the key of D minor because we're starting on D minor, but in the same way that we start our chorale on a D minor chord, we're still in the key of A minor, and that's ultimately the analysis I decided on. So we start off with F major again, F, C, F, and A. No need to reanalyze yet. Passing tone in the bass, passing tone in the alto. And then we get D, F, A, and D, which is D minor. And that's a 6 chord in the key of F, but in the key of A minor, it's a 4 chord. And I draw an immediate comparison to the first phrase here because of the fact that they share a key and the fact that they're starting with the same chord. Of course, Bach is going to go about going from one chord to the next differently because the phrases don't look similar rhythmically. Pretty much every voice is doing something different. And we even get a B flat here. So what's that all about? Why are we seeing B flat in the key of A minor? Well, I do think this is just it could be functioning as some sort of upper leading tone, like B flat just surrounding A. It is possible that Bach is just playing with the idea of morphing between D minor and A minor at the same time. We also have C sharp going on, but I think ultimately what's happening here is Bach is playing with the idea of different qualities being on either side of the secondary dominant. So the fact that we're getting C sharp and B flat is just further I guess, what is the word that I'm thinking of? He's just doubling down, literally doubling down on the idea that D minor is being tonicized here. But if you see on the other side of this chord, we're actually going to have a D major chord. So I think that, we're seeing two different chordal qualities on either side of the chord's dominant. So we start with a 4 chord, we go to C sharp diminished over E, E, G, B flat, and C sharp, which I guess could be analyzed as A as well, like an A7 chord, but I think that this is 7, 7-6-5 of 4. And then this A being in anticipation for the next chord, we get F sharp, D, A, and D, which is 4-6, so we're getting a minor 4 chord its dominant, and then a major 4 chord. So we have this interesting zone here where I think you could analyze this section in D minor. Maybe a modulation is even happening over the secondary dominant. I know that that was something that I used to be very hip to and analyze a lot earlier in my journey to analyze all of the harmonizations, but I've found that the majority of those analyses are probably not the most elegant way to analyze the modulations. They're accurate in terms of describing what's happening, but modulating over a secondary dominant is a pretty big deal, all things considered, and it just makes sense to say that the modulation is happening earlier. Generally speaking, it's safer to analyze a modulation happening earlier, like a little bit before you actually hear the tone being introduced. And what makes this particular modulation interesting is, like I said, we have C sharp and B flat. For all intents and purposes, it looks like we're in the key of D minor, but Bach sort of creates an interesting context here where what was a dominant functioning chord in the previous key, even though we were in F, we were still thinking about D minor at the beginning of this phrase. He was using it as like a fulcrum to pivot from a D minor chord to a D major chord and recontextualize this rising, what could have been a D minor scale, to an ascending A melodic minor scale. So that's the way that I look at it. Could be wrong. You might have your differing opinions, but that's the way that I see it, and being able to justify it with my words is what makes the videos a really helpful tool. We also have a passing 7th here in the tenor before we get G sharp, B, E, and E, which is E major over G sharp. That's another first inversion triad. This time it's a 5 chord with a passing 7th in the melody. We then have A, B, E, and C, drawing a comparison to the first phrase here. This B is like a 9/8 suspension or a 2/1 suspension over the bass, and as a result this E is sort of functioning like a suspension 2 that resolves upwards, which effectively turns this seemingly A minor triad to an F major triad, which is a 6 chord, F, A, F, and C. We then get D, A, F, and B, which is B minor 7 flat 5 over D. We know that Bach loves 2, 6, 5 chords in cadential situations, and we get a very similar profile to what we started with in our first phrase, right? 6, 2, we would expect 5 here, and that's exactly what we get. E, G sharp, E, and B, happening in a subdivided context here where 2 and 5 share a beat, and then we cadence on not A major this time, but A minor. A, C, E, and A. Okay, looking ahead, we have another interesting phrase. We're seeing pretty much all of the interesting aspects of this chorale jam-packed into the second system here. We're going to get a mid-phrase modulation, even though our final cadence or penultimate cadence ends in a deceptive, or penultimate phrase ends in a deceptive cadence in the key of D minor. I believe we start off in the key of F major, and we see kind of an interesting parallel or a bit of symmetry in comparison to the previous phrase. So we start off with D minor, D, D, F, and, we start off with B diminished over D, 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 F, and B, which is 2, 6, and I think this is where we modulate to the key of D minor to start things off, I keep saying, I misread my notes, apologies. This A minor chord I think is where we are modulating to the key of F major here. 3, and the reason why I think we're going to the key of F major rather than, say, the key of C major, because of this B diminished chord, has to do with the fact that we pretty much immediately after this B natural we immediately start seeing B flats. So I think this is just a tonicization of C, and we've been seeing a lot of 3 going to 5 recently. So starting off with this 3 chord being a gateway or a brief introduction to F major, it seems to make sense. We just get an intermediary chord here before we get 5. So D, D, F, and B would be 7, 6 of 5, because B is the leading tone to C, and C is our 5 chord. And then we get C, G, F, and C, this F being a 4/3 suspension over the bass, leaving us with C major as a result, C, C, E, and C, 3 roots and 1/3. And we would expect that to resolve to our tonic, and that's what it does. F, C, F, and A, tonic triad, root position. Passing tones in the outer voices, A, C, F, and C, that is F major in first inversion, so we'll just change the figured bass. Passing tones in the lower voices before we get C, E, E, and G, that's another 5 chord. And this is where it's kind of interesting, I think, because Bach immediately introduces the idea of C sharp going to and B flat kind of in a close proximity to one another. I think we're in a situation where we have a modulation zone, right? Any which one of these points from the F major chord moving forward could be a point where we've modulated to the key of D minor. I think this is another case where we modulate to D minor over this C major chord, which would be modulating over the subtonic 7th, which is an interesting choice because I would expect Bach to opt to modulate over this chord when there aren't as many common chords that, not as many common chords between the two keys. Something about modulating to the subtonic 7th is unusual to me. I don't know why. I can't really put my finger on it because technically speaking, this is a common chord modulation, but the chord that follows is seemingly a 5 chord, A, C sharp, E, and F. What's that F doing there? Is this some type of F major 7 sharp 5 over A? I don't think so. I think actually what's happening here is in a similar fashion to what we have like in the first phrase, for example. It makes more sense that this 7 chord is actually going to 1 and this C sharp is, the thing that's interesting about this is that this F, I think, is ultimately alluding to what's happening on the end of this beat, but we can't just neglect what's happening on the downbeat here. We have an A major triad, A, C sharp, E, but with this F in the melody, it creates a unique dissonance that gets resolved when the chord is respelled here on the and of 1. So I do feel like 5 is happening here. And it's not even that this, I guess we would have to mark this F as a non-chord tone here. That A is actually a chord tone that's shared between A major and D minor, but this F, this D, and this F here are ultimately alluding to what's going to happen on the and of the beat. So we have a 5 going to 1 progression here, but subtonic 7th going to 5 going to 1. Definitely an interesting progression. We have seen it in the past before, but I feel ultimately what's being alluded to here is 7 going to 1. This 5 feels more kind of like a means of getting to 1, something that just lengthens the journey, and 1 very easily could have happened on the beat, but Bach loves this E suspension going down to D. In the context of a D minor chord, for some reason we see it all the time, especially in D minor. So the fact that he takes this E and further contextualizes it with tones that turn it into an A major chord does make an impact, because 5 does want to go to 1, but the resolution happens 1/2 beat later, but the F stays consistent across the whole chord. So this is a context where I feel like the chord, even if it's not entirely spelled, does matter for the grand scheme of things. And I feel like we're drawing a comparison to the end of the A section here, where we see a sort of like an oscillation between 5 and 1 and 5, right? Because 1 is happening on the offbeat here too, even though it is a first inversion. Apologies, it should be 1/6, and this one is second inversion, 1/6/4. It's kind of happening on the same point, so maybe this is Bach's take on what was happening earlier, right at the end of the A section. But we move to G, B flat, C sharp, and E, and I think it's very possible that this could be a 7/4/3 chord, but again, I think this situation, just like the introduction here, or the first phrase that we hear at the beginning of the A section, means that there's a more likely culprit regarding what's happening here chord-wise. So this could be a 7 chord of some sort. I feel like this B flat is an accented non-chord tone, and really what's happening here is that this D is an anticipation, this G is like a passing 7th, and really it's this A, C sharp, and E. That's what's keeping it close to what's happening in the second phrase, or at the end of the second phrase. We just have counterpoint here, and Bach is playing with the idea of like functional dominance, right? So we have 7 and 5 happening at the same time. I just think a 5 chord can be extrapolated from what's going on here, and instead of saying this is a 7-4-3 chord going to a 5 chord going to a 1 chord, I feel like what's really just being implied here is one big dominant idea, and the likely dominant idea, because it's the last one heard before our final cadential chord, is 5. And this G, I guess technically speaking, would be a non-chord tone as well, because if I'm looking towards A to be the chord on this beat, G is just a 7th, a chordal 7th, but not pertinent to the spelling of this chord right now. And like I mentioned earlier, this is a deceptive cadence, so we don't cadence on D minor. We have the makings of it in the upper 3 voices, but it's actually the B flat that's our root, which would make this a B flat major chord, B flat, F, D, and D, which is our 6. And as we close in on our final phrase, it ends in a perfect authentic cadence in the key of D minor. We have a relatively short and straightforward phrase to analyze. We start off again with another secondary dominant, F sharp, A, D, and A, which is D major over F sharp. That would be 5/6 of 4, because D is the dominant of D. Sorry, D is the dominant of D. Now D is the dominant of G. The C is a 7th, but it's a non-chord tone in this context. And then we have G, B flat, D, and G, which is our 4 chord, so it resolves where we would expect. This E is a non-chord tone as well, so we'll mark it. We then get A, C sharp, and F, which is kind of an interesting chord. The C sharp must be an accented non-chord tone in this context, and we actually get 1-6-4 here. And then with this syncopation going on in the alto, we have a 4-3 suspension happening here over the bass, and what we really get is A, G, C sharp, and E, which would be an A7 chord. That's 5/7. Go ahead and put a bracket between these. And then we get D, G, A, and D, this G being a 4-3 suspension, this F sharp being our chord tone, and this E is sort of a lower neighbor that's ornamenting the F sharp, where we ultimately cadence on D major, D, F sharp, A, and D, which is our tonic triad, a major version of our tonic triad, as Bach often ends his minor chorales with a major triad. And that's pretty much all I have to say about this chorale. We have interesting mid-phrase modulations going on here, where we go from like F and then cadence in a different key. We do the same thing. Is there only one mid-phrase modulation? Yeah, there's only one mid-phrase modulation, where we go from F to D within the span of one phrase, and we don't finish in the same key that we modulated to at the beginning of the phrase. Other than that, the idea of the double suspension is kind of pertinent in this chorale as well, where we have, let's see, what's going on right here, the double suspension, where we're implying a 6 chord and both of the inner voices are being sustained for a length of time, and then they resolve. In this case, they're resolving outward. I don't think they really need to, but they're resolving and then revealing the chord, but there's 2 suspensions going on at the same time, which is pretty cool. We also get one a little bit earlier as well. Actually the exact same, and these ones are resolving inward, but the idea of contrary motion going on probably plays a role in the effectiveness or the sound. But other than that, I think that's pretty much everything there is to note about this chorale. I think this moment right here with 4 going to 7 of 4, going to 4 as a major chord is pretty beautiful. Probably the maker's mark, the chef's kiss of this particular chorale, in my opinion, from an analytical standpoint. And that's pretty much going to wrap up my analysis. If you're interested in following me along on the journey to analyze all of Bach's chorale harmonizations, feel free to subscribe to the channel. You can hit the notification icon as well if you're interested in getting notified of my daily upload. And you could also like the video if you enjoyed the content. It helps me out a ton. and means that more people are going to see my videos, which is helpful for me as a content creator. But with all that being said, thank you so much for watching the video. Thank you so much for supporting the channel by doing so. I look forward to tomorrow's analysis, and I hope you take care.